From the Centre for Public Christianity, you're listening to Life and Faith. I'm Natasha Moore.
And I'm Simon Smart.
A couple of years back, the terrorist extremist group ISIS took control of the city of Mosul in Iraq. Mosul was one of the earliest centres of Christianity, and the Christians living there were issued an ultimatum: pay a tax, convert to Islam, or die by the sword. Stories of Christians and other minorities being persecuted and murdered, of people abandoning their homes, fleeing the terror of ISIS, reverberated around the world.
Iraq's largest Christian city now seized by ISIS militants.
As the Islamic State made another dramatic push through northern Iraq, tens of thousands fled their towns and villages before the militants, who are notorious for beheadings.
There are reports tonight that a quarter of Iraq's Christian population is fleeing the Iraqi city of Karakosh and other surrounding towns.
In recent months, Iraqi troops backed by US forces started to make cracks in the ISIS stronghold of Mosul. And last October, the town of Karakosh to the south of the city was recaptured, and a handful of townspeople returned home and erected a makeshift cross on the roof of their church, and church bells rang out from the damaged tower for the first time in years.
The Christians in Iraq are not an anomaly. Persecution, suffering and dying for what you believe in. It's something that Christians have faced from their earliest days, and more Christians are martyred for their faith today than back in the days of being thrown to the lions in Rome. Whether or not you're a religious believer yourself, religious freedom and persecution are issues of justice and human rights that all of us have a stake in, wherever we live, whatever we believe.
Nik and Ruth Ripken, a couple hailing from Kentucky originally, set out to uncover why people keep their faith in places where they are getting killed because of it. They've travelled to over 70 countries and spoken with more than 600 Christians to ask them why they don't just give up. The reason for this is personal. They were Christian missionaries to Somalia, and what they saw there shook their confidence in what they believed.
They killed 4 of my best friends on one day, and they threw their bodies away somewhere in a trash or toilet. And we went from 1988 to 2013, and every Somali believer was killed. We never had their body at their funeral. Extremists stole their bodies and took them away, so we didn't have a way of telling their story when they died, and we had no way of going to a place where they were buried so we could tell our children's children about them. So I left Somalia. And our mission organization, others thought, well, here's the Ripkens going to develop discipleship resources for people working in the hard places. I had to go find out, because I couldn't pray any longer or say any longer, greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world, because it wasn't true in Somalia.
We'll hear more from both Nik and Ruth Ripken about the persecuted church. But first we wanted to hear about their own experience in Africa. And it didn't start in Somalia. Rather, they had a relatively comfortable setup in Malawi.
In my mind, I really thought when I went to Africa that I would go to one place, I would learn a language, I would live in that place, I would love and fall in love with the people, and I would have this deep relationship that would last for years. And so we got to Malawi thinking that's what we were going to do. We learned language. We lived among the people. We were seeing opportunities to share about Jesus in villages that we would break down. Our vehicle would break down on the road, and villagers would run out to meet us, and we would spend the night with them, and in that we could share about Jesus. But we got to the point where we got so sick with malaria that the doctors came and said, you cannot stay in this place. There's no way you can live here and survive. And that was difficult for me because I had given my heart to that place.
Now, you've mentioned Somalia. That was a very, very difficult place. Probably still is. But when you were there, Mogadishu was a bit of a hellhole, wasn't it?
I started out the first time, the only place I could get to was Hargeisa up in Somaliland. And I think out of 700 homes, 7 of them still had roofs on them. And as they drove me around the city, and you're seeing all these dead camels and goats and everything, they would say, over there's where there used to be a Pepsi factory, and over there used to be a school, and there used to be a hospital, and it was a city of used to be. And They were finding about 50 landmines a day, usually when animals or kids stepped on them. And I went up there to try to find an orphanage that some other folks had been running and had got chased out, and see if we couldn't keep those kids back together. And then probably a couple months later, the United Nations decided that all transportation in and out of Somalia would go through Mogadishu. So Mogadishu is where I went, and within the next 6 months, we've got about 8 or 10 people working with us. We're feeding 50,000 people a day. That's usually after burying about 20 children, older people that died during the night. You called it a hellhole. I was there 6 months. We're living in Nairobi. So I'm going in and out for a month, 6 weeks. We never went together. Didn't want the kids put both parents at the risk at the same time. And then sometimes Ruth would go in, but the kids really liked better when Mama stayed and Dad went. And so we spent a lot of time apart, and I would travel the Horn of Africa and then come out and spend a couple weeks with my wife and children, and to the point to where they could dictate to you as if they were there, because they would walk through that emotionally with me, and I would show them photographs and stories that I had written down. But to be there 6 months before you meet a woman that hadn't been raped, multiple times, and to be resettling refugees, and then eventually we're doing mobile medical clinics, and it's such that you go into a place and you literally save people's lives, and as you come out, they throw rocks at you, they throw human waste at you, they shoot at you, because there's things in the culture that cause that to happen, and the outsider is always an enemy.
When you experienced all of that, was that personally taking a heavy toll on you?
It was like going to Disneyland. No, it was, what I do is when I'm watching all of this horrible stuff and I'm holding this 3-year-old that weighs 9 to 11 pounds, and I go in the next room and I help set a little boy's arm, and he doesn't even have an aspirin, and I go in the next room and we take out an appendix and we're having to hold a kid down and we don't have any anesthetic, and I come back and that little girl I just loved on has died, and they can't even now tell me what they did with her body. And so I put that in a closet in my head. But then I'm smart enough, or I don't know what I am. I'm a survivor from a rough family, that when I come out and get to a safe place like my Ruth, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, I open that closet, and she helps me walk that stuff out, and so it leaves a scar, but it doesn't leave cancer, if that makes any sense to you.
What was that like for you, Ruth?
I felt the urgency of what we were doing. And I felt we were doing something that was making a difference in people's lives. So there was an urgency of that task. And I felt like my task was to make sure that I was praying for Nick as he went every trip he took, that I was there when he needed me. One of the most beautiful things that my husband has done for 40 years of marriage is anytime we are not together, he keeps a little notebook and he jots down every story he wants to tell me when we're back together. So there are many places in Somalia I never got to visit, but through
sometimes she corrects me and tells me, no, this is what happened to you when you were there.
But I feel like I've been there because he made sure that myself and our boys were partners in what we did. We know that we can't survive by ourselves. And I knew that my husband was doing something that was so desperately needed. And we truly fell in love with Somali people. And we felt the urgency of doing what we were doing.
One thing that you certainly both did go through together was the loss of your son in Kenya.
As we think about that night, it's memories that will always be there. But as Tim made that sound in the hallway that I'd heard since he was 7 years old of an asthma attack, and those who have children who have asthma, it's a haunting sound that will never go away. But he was 16 years old, and he had grown very athletic and very strong. So by the time he had the attack, it was very severe. And the rains had started in Nairobi, and if you've ever been in a tropical climate where the rains build up and build up and build up, and then finally it's just a torrential rain, and that's exactly what happened that night. As he came to the room, I woke Nick up, and Nick got him in the vehicle to rush him to the hospital. We'd done this before, and so in my mind, I thought it'll be just like every other time where they go to the hospital and then they'll be home in a little while. But the phone rang, and Nick said, "You need to come." And so I woke up our oldest son, and I said, "You need to ride with me to the hospital." And he came, and we got to the hospital, and I knew it was bad. There was another time in my life where my husband said, "You need to come," and it was also a very serious time. And so those words haunt me even to this day. But as we stood in that hospital and began to think about what we were dealing with, the thing that kept my knees from collapsing totally were verses that I had learned in the kitchen with my mother. And all I could say was, "I will not leave you nor forsake you." And that's what kept ringing in my ears.
And I'm very different from Ruth. I didn't have the DNA that she had. And when she woke me up and I saw Tim, I quickly gave him, for the first time, an EpiPen shot. It didn't make any difference whatsoever. I put him in the car. Then it's about 2 o'clock on Easter Sunday morning, and he stopped breathing. And there was a guy coming out of a shopping center that should not have been existed. I don't even know who he was. I don't know if he was an angel driving a car, but I ran him off the road. And he came out yelling and surprised that he wasn't being robbed, and he was surprised that it was a white guy. And I told him what was happening, and I made him drive while I worked and did CPR and got Tim's heart beating, and he was breathing again. And then I got to the hospital, and they got to working on him, and I called my wife and a friend, and she left the 11-year-old home asleep. And I went in there, and they said, "Well, we've got him stabilized, and he's breathing, his heart's beating." And I looked at them. I said, "You're not aware of what's going on. He either comes back from this by now, or he's going to die. So if there's something else you can do, you do it, and do it now." And the main doctors that I knew weren't there at that time of night, and so they took him upstairs. And then Ruth came, and our friend came, our oldest son's there, and we waited for maybe an hour or so and didn't get any word from them, and then walked upstairs, and there they were sitting with their head in their hands. They didn't have the courage to come down to tell us that sweet boy had died. And so, but for me, I looked at Ruth, and I could see the peace of God and acceptance in her faith, in her face, and that's not where I was. I was in another place maybe that was just as healthy, but Somalia had forever changed me to where I never ask anymore, "Why me, Lord?" You know, I don't whine to Jesus like so many Westerners do when their cable TV goes out, or they don't get the president they want in the last election. Of course, that doesn't bother anybody these days. And so, but I ask, why not me? Because we had been with people who had lost their wives, who had watched their wives raped, their children raped, and their other clan leaders left them alive because they knew that would be a greater punishment to that man than if they killed him. And we had sat with hundreds of women who had watched their husbands die and their children starve, and they're the only one left alive. And I had to ask God, why do I have a wife that's not ever been molested? Why do I have children that are healthy, and they get to play sports, and they get to eat food? And so sometimes I would look at my boys, and there they were happy and playing and had food, and mama's loving on them, and I would just pick them up in my arms and weep. And other times they'd be fussing over a video game or something, and I'd say, "Don't you know what I've been seeing all of these days?" And the youngest one time looked at me and said, "Dad, isn't it time for you to go back to Mogadishu?" And so I had to learn how to unpack all of this stuff that I was going through and not beat up my wife and children with it. But at the same time, when I stood next to Timmy, and there was nothing else I could do for him. I was thanking God that I only lost one child.
We got back home. We called a lot of people. We had people knocking on the door we had never met who loved and cared for us. And so we watched a whole community revolve around us for a while to carry us when we couldn't carry ourselves.
Timmy died in March on Easter Sunday morning, and we didn't fix another meal until mid-June when we flew back to America. But I am so tired of casseroles. If I never eat another casserole, I will be delighted. And Hindu casseroles and Muslim casseroles and Christian casseroles and animist casseroles, and why can't somebody just give me a piece of chicken or something, But like Ruth was saying, just the God's people just came out of the woodwork to love on us and to take care of us, and again, our house was just flooded with people. It took us a week to get Timmy buried. We got a miracle where they allowed us to bury him at the school that he loves and where his other two brothers have graduated. And so he's just in a beautiful place. And so we've got all these people coming to the house, and they're now, he died Saturday night, Easter Sunday morning, and so 5 nights later, it's in the afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There's another knock at the door. So I thought maybe it's somebody coming visiting the kids or somebody with another casserole. And I looked, and here's the chief of staff from Somalia. His lips are cracked and bleeding. He's dehydrated. He's probably lost 10 or 15 pounds. His T-shirt is ragged. He's dirty as he can be, and he smells, like a dead goat. And I said, "Where in the world have you come from?" I was so startled, and he just stood up with all the pride he could muster, this Muslim man, and he said, "I've come to bury our son Timothy." And I just threw my arms around him. And see, I'd called him on the shortwave radio on Sunday morning after we'd called family, and it just threw family. They were so confused because we're calling, telling them Timmy has died on Easter Sunday morning, and it's still Saturday night in America. And they're saying, "No, he can't be dead. It's not Sunday yet." And because that's the way that grief works sometimes. And so, I called in to tell Omar, I said, "I can't come in. Here's what's happened." And we've had him in our home. We've had him out in Nairobi to some United Nations conferences, and he's well known. And when I told him that Timmy had died, he didn't say a word, and he's so extroverted. He makes me look like an introvert. And he had just laid the microphone down, he told me later, and he just started walking. And he walked 5 days from Mogadishu to Nairobi, Kenya, and he had to work his way through landmines. He had to work his way through clans that were fighting. He was able to ride on a camel part of the way. Then he hitched a ride in the back of a goat truck, and that's why he smelled like he did. And he got to our doorstep, and he had walked 5 days to help us bury our son. And he sat between Ruth and I couldn't stop him, at our son's funeral. And somewhere, and he's just doing 180s with his head, and listening and watching our son sing in the choir, watching Ruth's brother bringing a message. He had never been to a Christian funeral before, and he's just listening and watching. And about halfway through that, he reached over and took my hand and reached over and took Ruth's hand and put our hands together in his calloused Muslim hands. Now, if a Muslim walks 5 days to help a Christian bury his son, I'm not going to build no wall. What do I owe Muslims as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus? What do I owe Muslims if that's the kind of love they show me?
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're partway through our conversation with Nik and Ruth Ripken about the persecution that Christians face in more than 60 countries worldwide.
Let's just think about some of the places, because you do an awful lot of talking to people who are Christian believers around the world suffering persecution. Tell us about the church in China.
I spent most of my time in house churches, and it seems that I was able, as much as I could, to track their leadership. structured to where I feel comfortable. There were about 10 million people in each one of those movements. And they, up until 1970, almost all of those churches started through miracles of healing. And then they got more access to the Bible and more access to people coming in and more access just to their own evangelists and pastors. And I watched what was so different with them and from my own theological education, that once they had shared their faith in the marketplace and led 10 to 12 people to Christ, then they led a Sunday school or a Bible study. And once they led, anywhere from 20 to 30 people to Christ in the marketplace, then they sort of qualified for the role of a pastor, evangelist, church planner.
Isn't it also the case that in China, unless your pastor's been in jail, you can't fully trust them yet?
Well, yeah, you're playing. They gave me a hard time because I got off one of the first movements. They just introduced themselves and they just startled me. The first question was, Nick, has Jesus made it to other countries, or is China the only place he's made it to? And I'm telling them about faith in Africa and in America, and they dance and they sing and they're so glad that Jesus has made it to other countries. And then they tell me that out of the 150, 170 people I'm meeting, and I found that consistent in that snapshot of China in those couple of years, that 40% of their leadership had spent at least 3 years in prison. And they said, Nick, Nick, prison is our theological seminary. Now that you're in China, how many degrees would you like to have? And I said, I'm good. Mama needs me at home, and the boys miss me. And so they actually said to me, I interviewed one of the most talented, gifted young men in his late 20s, and as he walked away, this old man that I'd interviewed found he'd been in prison 3 times, 3 years each time, and he whispered to me, he says, you can't trust him. I said, oh, is he from the government? Or, oh, no, don't be foolish. He just hasn't been to prison yet.
That's where you earn your credibility.
Yeah, and so where does that leave me?
You've spoken to lots of people in the Middle East as well, sometimes very unlikely people, about faith.
For Ruth and I to love Muslims, to be in their homes and not risking their lives to protect us, is 100 times more difficult now than it was, say, 10 years ago because of government stance. But still, in most of the places we travel, Afghanistan would be different, Syria would be different, Iraq, some places be different. It takes us about 15 minutes with a Muslim before they'll take us out to tea. After they've welcomed us to their country, welcomed us to their city, they will welcome us to a tea shop, and in 30 minutes they will make arrangements for Ruth and I and our kids to come to their house and eat, or whoever that's in our group and on our team. And it takes about 30 minutes to get invited to a Muslim's home.
I think one of the things we know is that for Muslims who are coming to our countries, to Australia, to America, they're coming by the thousands. And as we meet them, we always ask them, where are you from? How long have you been here? What's your feelings about being in America? Have you ever talked to a Christian? Have you ever heard about Jesus? And their response...
Has anybody ever welcomed you to America?
And their response is always almost totally negative on all of those questions. And the last one we ask is, what are your feelings? And they'll tell us over and over, this is the loneliest place we have ever lived. To me, that just says we're not doing what we need to do. Welcoming people to where we live is, like Nick said, so common for them. I never went anywhere in the Middle East that I was not welcomed in that place.
There's been some talk of people express the fear that Christians are actually going to be exterminated in the Middle East in the foreseeable future, with the rise of ISIS and the success they had across Iraq and Syria. Do you have a sense of what that might mean for Iraqi Christians?
I went all through the Muslim world, the Arab Christian world, and so what we found in the Arab Christian world was 95% of them would never share their faith with a Muslim. And if a Muslim, I saw this in Turkey, I watched it with my own eyes. If a Muslim comes and says, I want to know who Jesus is, they say, go away, you have your own prophet. And when they come and say, I found Jesus, I want to be baptized, they say, this is not for you, go away. Oh my goodness, I watched. In one place, 17 pastors' daughters were enticed away from their families intentionally by Muslims using perfume and jewelry and just all the things that the world has to offer. And then these girls married them, targeted pastors' daughters, and these girls disappear into the Muslim world, and their families never know where they are, never meet their grandchildren, never see their daughters again, and that's happening year after year after year. And I had one pastor grab me by the shirt front, and they said, "And you want me to love these people? You want me to forgive these people?" And so my heart just became so broken and critical until I realized, guess where I'm from? I'm from the South. I bet you couldn't tell by my accent. And all of a sudden I realized, okay, I'm blaming the Arab Christian church for the exact same heart illness that whites have in the South toward blacks. I had never shared a meal with a black until I went to Africa. Love them? Well, I don't. How am I going to love my enemies when I don't even love black people that are on the football team with me? And I'm not even willing to break bread with them. And so after being overseas, I had to ask God for forgiveness and go home and do that, which I hadn't done, to the disgust of my family in Kentucky. They were glad for me to do what I was doing with black people, but because Africans weren't really black. Our black people in America are really different, but it's the same thing. And I don't know how in the world they're going to find the ability to love their enemies, but I promise you, there's so much hatred by Muslim toward Muslim in the world you're talking about, that if followers of Christ, if they call themselves followers of Christ, love their enemies, it will judge so much the hate that Muslims have for each other that it will stand out just like the star that the wise men followed. It'll be that bright and shining.
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Natasha Moore.
Also, as we're fast approaching Christmas, we wanted to ask Nik and Ruth about how persecuted Christians around the world experience this event. But his response was quite unexpected and even confronting. He refers here to parts of the Christmas story that we don't often talk about, like how after the birth of Jesus, King Herod sends men to kill all the boys in Bethlehem under 2 years of age. He's so afraid of losing his throne after hearing from the wise men about the birth of a king in his realm that he massacres a bunch of children. Here's Nik.
Now, you mentioned the bright star, and we're coming up to Christmas. What do persecuted Christians around the world typically face? How will they experience that moment?
You don't want me to answer that question. The Chinese asked me about the holidays that we celebrate. They thought I was lying when they heard that we had a government that actually thanked God for the harvest. We had a day called Thanksgiving. They could not imagine on earth that there was ever a government like that. And Easter, they sort of said, okay, you get a C- on this because you do a sort of a drive-by shooting on Easter. And when I described Christmas as in America, they almost called me a non-believer. Because first of all, they said, how have you in the West corrupted the Bible so much? I said, excuse me, I've got a doctorate. I don't corrupt the Bible. But we have. We've moved the wise men from Matthew 2, and we put them in the story in Luke 2 when they didn't meet Jesus until he was 2 years of age. And the Chinese were so upset at me, but here's the point. Nowhere have we gone, if Westerners have not been there, do we find local people celebrating Christmas. Because they're used to having angels sing, and something great happen, but what happens next? You get to have a baby and you're not married. And somebody makes you pregnant and you have no control over that. And they know what it's like to have a baby in a manger. And they know what it's like to be taxed and be pregnant and have to go from one city to the other. And they know what it's like that when good stuff happens, the next thing that comes is Herod with his murderers down to kill all your babies. And God sends his son to Egypt. Why didn't God send everybody else's son to Egypt? And so there's just a lot in that story that in my culture in America, we make it into the story we love the most. The Chinese talk about, in that story, about how the wise men were unwise. They did not learn language and culture, and the way they did their work caused the death of those children, and how the scribes and Pharisees got in bed with Herod at the birth of Jesus, never got out of bed with the government. And they talked about in the story, what if you're a parent in the story and at the birth of Jesus, your kids are killed? How can you ever follow the Messiah? And they talk about what it's like to be Jesus, and even when you do everything right, there's a cross waiting for you. And so the believers take Christmas and turn it on its head and make it a teaching experience of what life is like when you're in this war between good and evil.
That's Nik Ripken with a very unexpected interpretation of the Christmas story. But it's a good reminder of how powerful and relevant that story is to our messed up world. Next week, we're turning our attention to Australia with a story from the outback. We look forward to your company there.